Probably the factors that were most, you could say, the supporting factors in my life to become a Buddhist, besides my own karma, were possibly the confusion of the time, because I was a student back in the 60s, and what happened to President Kennedy, and then the war in Vietnam escalated, and I was exposed to a lot of suffering, which disturbed many, many people in our generation, to see that the U.S., the American dream had fallen apart. Because our dream was that if people had material wealth, if they had a two-car garage, a nice house in the suburbs, husband has a beautiful wife and a few kids, and they're all going to a nice school, and they have wonderful clothes, and they can eat good food, then, that's nirvana, that's utopia. And that was the American dream, and it just fell apart back in the 60s, and then all these people went off and started looking for something else, because they didn't accept that kind of standard anymore. They were looking for something more meaningful and deeper. And so a lot of them tried a lot of different things in those times to try to find out what was really true. Some of the things worked, and some of them didn't. And some were beneficial. I mean, I think for a lot of them, they really had a sincere desire to find a more meaningful way of life than just dedicating your whole life to materialistic values, and providing for sensual pleasures and a certain kind of security in material things. And that is something we didn't find. Our generation did not find security in material pleasures and in material things. We were looking for something that could provide more meaning for us in our lives. So in that sense, the Vietnam War was a kind of a catharsis, or it provided a turning point in my life to question dukkha. And I was traveling in Europe at the time, and when I got to Switzerland and I started reading the Dhammapada, as soon as I read the Dhammapada, I said, oh my gosh, all my questions are here and they've all been answered. It was just like that. And at that point, as soon as I read the Dhammapada, I knew that I was a Buddhist. I had to become a Buddhist. So at that point, I wanted to become a monk. That was in 1968. But I was in Switzerland at the time. I didn't know anything about Theravada Buddhism. I had only heard a little bit about Zen. So I was making arrangements at that time to I wanted to travel. My dream was to travel through India and eventually go to a monastery in Japan. But for various reasons of you might say, various karmic impediments that I had created in my life and in the past, I was unable to fulfill that goal and went back to the States. Eventually ended up practicing Zen Buddhism for about 11 years. And then one day I was in a library doing a kind of a self-retreat. And as I was walking out, I looked up on the shelf and I saw a book called Living Buddhist Masters by Jack Kornfield. And I opened that book and I said, oh my gosh, I didn't know people were still practicing Theravada Buddhism. I thought it had died out, actually. So then I got really interested, and then I found out about Goenka. I started practicing, doing meditation retreats, with the Goenka Center in Massachusetts, in the U.S. And eventually I got involved in yoga, I met my wife, we got married, but I always had that interest in Buddhism. And so finally I had the chance. When I heard about Pa Auk Sayadaw, I felt this was an opportunity, and I went to Burma and I practiced under him for 8 months. Then I went back, and eventually my wife and I separated, and I had a chance to kind of live my dream, so to speak, and go back to Burma, Myanmar, and in 2002 I ordained again and became a Bhikkhu. Spent 6 years there, and then traveled around, spent some time in Australia and Sri Lanka, and now I'm here. So that's my story.